chapter number 41. We are back in our study of the life of Joseph from the book of Genesis, and we are on lesson number 35. Last week we looked at Joseph in prison, and he gets promoted there in prison to a position of leadership within the prison. He was trustworthy, and we covered that out of chapter number 40. And really, in addition to that, and looking at that role, we were introduced to two fellow prisoners that Joseph had met while he was in there, the chief butler, the chief baker. And there was no chief candlestick maker in this story, all right? But the chief butler and the chief baker, both of them had dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams. And as we finished out chapter number 40, we had left the scene where Joseph doesn't have a whole lot to say to the baker because he's going to die in 3 days. But to the butler, he's going to be restored. And he says to the butler, when you're restored to Pharaoh's position there, when you're able to get into communication with Pharaoh, please speak of me to Pharaoh. Let him know that I'm here unjustly, and remember me. And that's where we kind of wrapped up chapter number 40 there in verse number, let's see here. Joseph asked the chief baker to do those things, and then in verse number 23, we find that the butler is restored, and yet he did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. We find that in the end of verse number 23. So chapter 41 begins with verse number 1. It says to this, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river." And we're going to find here in these first 9 verses some truths about the dreams of Pharaoh. All right, so verse number 2 goes on. "And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat flesh, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day." We are introduced to this topic, number 1. We're going to look at the dreams of Pharaoh, and there's some words that are used here in these first 8 verses describing the dreams of Pharaoh that are words that we don't really use in English today. All right, so one of those words is kine, K-I-N-E, which is simply an Old English word that means cows. All right, so that's what the first dream is talking about. It's speaking of cows. We find that they are ill-favored, they are lean-fleshed. It just means that they were skinny, scrawny-looking cows, okay? And so it's just an old, polite way of saying it. Letter A under number 1. Pharaoh's first dream was about 7 strong cows being eaten up by 7 skinny cows. The second dream in verses 5 through 7 is about 7 plump ears of corn being eaten up by 7 skinny ears of corn. To describe the corn, they call it rank and good. Now, if we say, "Oh, that is rank," that's not normally a compliment. If I walk into a child's bedroom and they've taken their shoes off or something, or several of them, 7 girls all in one room, and they all take their shoes off at the same time, you say, "Whoa, something died in here." But it's not, nothing died, it's just my feet smelled the same way. In fact, when I was a teenager, my feet stunk so bad that my parents made me stick my shoes out on the porch roof. I had a window and the porch roof was right out there, and my shoes had to stay outside. That's how bad my feet stink, so I can't really complain about it. But my room was kind of rank when I was a teenager. My feet stunk. Here it's talking about rank and good, talking about something that is plump, something that is full ear of corn there, and that's what's being described. So they're strong, they're plump ears of corn. They're being eaten by 7. The skinny ears calls them thin and blasted with an east wind. That idea of something that has just been scorched and really not a lot of water. It's been taken out of there, and that's what that second dream is. Letter C. We find that these dreams had an effect on Pharaoh's spirit in verse number 8. He has the first dream. He wakes up in the middle of the night, thinks, what in the world did I just dream? Goes back to sleep, has the second dream, And in verse number 8, he wakes up in the morning, and in the morning his spirit's troubled. And so from that we find that he was troubled enough that he calls for all the wise men, he calls for all the magicians in Egypt, and he says to them, "This is my dream." Now there's other accounts in Scripture, kings that have had a dream, and they'll call their wise men, they'll call their magicians together, and they'll say, "You know what? You tell me the dream and the interpretation." That's not what happened here. Pharaoh gives them the dream, and these guys aren't even able to make something up. They come to a dead end there, and they could not find the interpretation. We find letter D, these dreams have an effect on the magicians and the wise men, and that is that they could not give the interpretation. Pharaoh is troubled in his spirit. The magicians are at a loss of what do we say. We don't know the answer to give. We find that at the end of verse number 8, that Pharaoh told them his dream. There was none that could interpret these dreams unto Pharaoh. And so can you imagine the scene in the court at that point, at Pharaoh's court at that point in time? Pharaoh's stressed out about this. He's had these dreams. What do they mean? He's called in, if I can use the term, the experts of the day. And these guys are all standing there. I don't know. You ever take your car to the mechanic and say, it's making this noise? And they say, well, I don't know. That's not really a comforting experience. Go to the doctor. I'm having this symptom. Well, I don't know what that is. Anymore, I think they just guess anyhow and try something and bring you back in a couple of days and see if what works. I'm only half joking about that. But here's the thing that's awkward in Pharaoh's court. We find in verse number 9 that these dreams had an effect on the butler as well. In verse number 9, then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, and saying, I do remember my faults this day. The butler somehow comes into the court at the same time when these magicians, these wise men, Pharaoh, everything's there. You can cut the tension with a knife in that room. What's the issue? The issue is that Pharaoh has had a dream, and there's not a single person who can interpret that dream. And can you imagine the butler? Oh, I had a dream. I remember back in jail there, I had this dream. So did the baker. He had a dream. And he remembers his fault this day, and he speaks to Pharaoh in verse number 9. Let me ask you a question before we get into number 2. Well, I'm just going to get into number 2. Never mind. I will cover it in number 2. I'll cover it in number 2. We find in number 2 that Joseph's introduced to Pharaoh. In verse number 9 through verse number 16, the Bible says this, Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night. I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man in Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man, according to his dream, did he interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was, me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I want you to put yourself in, before we get into the notes here, I want you to put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Joseph's been sold by his brothers to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites have carried him down to Egypt. In Egypt, he's been sold to Potiphar. Potiphar purchases him. Joseph is loyal. He's faithful. He serves in Potiphar's house. He raises to a position in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife is tempting him. He won't sin with her. And the incident takes place. He runs. He flees that temptation. She makes up a lie about him. Joseph ends up in prison. From the time that he was sold to the time that he interprets the dream of the butler and the baker is 11 years. He's 17 when he's sold into slavery. He's 28 years old when he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker. Now, those years between 17 and 28, do you think there were some things that Joseph would have rather done than be in slavery? Okay, you go back between 17 and 28. Did you want to be a slave? Put any numbers in there. No, you really don't. Okay, so Joseph has kind of missed out on some of the prime years, and he reaches this point. He interprets the dream of the butler and baker, and he thinks, here it is. I'm finally going to get my break. And how long goes by? 2 years. The butler forgets about him for a day or two. Have you ever anticipated something and then it didn't come? Oh, the butler, he's going to be restored. Maybe this week I'll get out of jail. Maybe next week I'll get out of jail. Nothing. So Joseph sits down and has a pity party for himself in prison and gets depressed. Is that what we read? I don't think so. I think he continued to be faithful. And here's a couple points I want to make. Joseph's introduced to Pharaoh, letter A, at the right time. Joseph is introduced to Pharaoh at the right time. We find in chapter number 40 last week in verses 14 and 15 that Joseph had desired to be spoken of to Pharaoh 2 years prior. In verse number 14, the Bible says, Joseph speaking to the butler, he says to him, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house, for I indeed was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Joseph's being honest here. He says, I was sold by my brothers. I haven't done a single thing wrong. I'm innocent. If you could just show me this kindness, he uses that word in verse number 14. If you could show me this kindness and just mention my case to Pharaoh, maybe Pharaoh would take sympathy upon my case and let me out of here. He's asking basically to have his sentence commuted by someone who could do something about it. Nothing wrong with that request. Number 2, under letter A. Joseph had desired to be spoken of to Pharaoh 2 years prior, but being spoken of to Pharaoh was God's plan. That's what God wanted. God wanted Joseph to be spoken of to Pharaoh, but Joseph had to wait for God's timing as well. Joseph doesn't have the wrong desire. He has the right desire. God desires for Joseph to be spoken of to Pharaoh. And Joseph mentions that to the butler, and you've heard me preach it, and I don't have it in your notes there, but you've heard me preach it. There's a need for us to know the will of God and also to know the timing of God. It was absolutely God's will for Joseph to be spoken of to Pharaoh, but not at the time when Joseph originally requested the butler to do it. Letter C. The butler's words to Pharaoh at this point in time were likely much more urgent and emphatic after realizing his mistake. Have you ever been there? You had an appointment scheduled, and you really weren't looking forward to it, but you were going to do it anyway, or you're going to something like that, and something comes up, and you totally forget about it. Oh, and then you feel horrible. Now, so far, I've never forgotten my wife's birthday or anniversary. If I ever forget her birthday, I'm like really dead because her birthday's on Valentine's Day, and there's all kinds of reminders for about 6 weeks prior to her birthday. But if I forgot her birthday, number one, I would just find a rock and crawl under it, I think, and just hide there. But number two, if she said, sweetheart, do you think you could fix the leaky faucet? I'm probably going to be much more emphatic about getting that done, right? Here's the butler. Joseph has asked him 2 years ago, will you mention me to Pharaoh? The butler gets restored, and I think just in the excitement of being restored, it just slips his mind. In that, I think to some degree, God may have had a part in shielding him from it for such a time as this. And God brings the timing along. But the butler's now in a position to whereby Pharaoh doesn't know what the dream means. The wise men don't know what the dreams mean. The magicians don't know what the dream means. And the butler says, I know someone who knows the answer. And he speaks up to Pharaoh without being asked. Can you imagine the tension in that room? And the butler stands up and he says, I know somebody who can interpret a dream. Right in front of all the experts. Right in front of Pharaoh. Who is this guy? Well, he's a foreigner that's in prison. That's the resume that Joseph had in Egypt, isn't it? Okay, so you're with me here. So Joseph's introduced to Pharaoh, letter A, at the right time. Letter B, he's introduced to Pharaoh by the right person. He's introduced by the right person. Number one, under letter B, the butler was empathetic to both Pharaoh and Joseph. He, like Joseph, had been a prisoner. He knew what it was like to be in that prison. He had actually served in the prison under Joseph. Joseph had been in charge there. They had been cellmates in that sense, so they were in that same prison together. So he truly knew, he truly understood what Joseph's going through in being a prisoner. At the same time, he's empathetic to Pharaoh because he understands what it is to have a dream and not know the interpretation of it. And God has Joseph be introduced to Pharaoh at the right time and by the right person. Number two, we find that the butler had experienced firsthand what Joseph or what Pharaoh was looking for, and that is the interpretation of a dream. In verse number 10, the butler begins to relay the story or relay the history. He says this, Pharaoh was wroth with his servants. Now, this is only 2 years ago. I'm sure Pharaoh probably remembers this event. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, putting me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed in one night, I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. How many dreams took place that night? 2 total. 2 individual men had one dream, 2 dreams. Joseph interprets how many dreams that night? 2 dreams. They both come true. Pharaoh, in one night, has had 2 dreams. And so the scenario's lining up here, and the butler is saying to Pharaoh, I've experienced what you're looking for, and that is the interpretation of a dream. He says in verse number 12, there's a young man with us, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. We told him, he interpreted to us our dreams, to each man according to his dream did he interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was, me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. He says, Mr. Pharaoh, this isn't just a guy that's making up things that are fun to hear or nice to hear. Both of them came true. One was kind of wonderful. I experienced that. One was terrible. The baker lost his head in that sense. Number 3, the butler could validate Joseph's accuracy in the interpretation. And so we find he was brought to Pharaoh by the right person. On the second side of your lesson sheet this morning, then, letter C, we find he's introduced at the right time by the right person, letter C, for the right reason. He's introduced to Pharaoh for the right reason. In verse number 14 through 16, we find Pharaoh's response. Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. They brought him hastily out of the dungeon. Okay, so put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Do you think Joseph has circled on his calendar, today is the day that I get out? They just show up at the prison and they say, Mr. Joseph, you are wanted at the palace. The Pharaoh wants to talk to you. What's Joseph's response? In verse number 14, he comes, he shaves himself, changes his garments. He comes to Pharaoh. Verse number 15, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream. There is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph said, you know, Mr. Pharaoh, that's right. You're still looking at your Bible, right? That's not what Joseph says. Joseph says to Pharaoh, you know, I've been imprisoned unjustly. I've been a slave for these 13 years. I demand a trial. I demand retributions. Joseph doesn't say a single thing about that. You look at verse number 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh and he says this. It is not in me. And I can almost feel Pharaoh's whole hope fall. And Joseph goes on. He says this. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Why did God bless Pharaoh in Potiphar's house? I think right here's an illustration of how Joseph never missed an opportunity to glorify God in front of anybody he was in front of. Mr. Pharaoh, I can't interpret dreams, but I serve a God who can, and he will. What a blessing. He's introduced to Pharaoh for the right reason. Number 1, Joseph is called upon to do what no other man in Egypt could do, And honestly, at the end of the day, it's not something that Joseph himself is even capable of doing. I'll leave that one for right now. Okay, we might come back to it. Number 2, Joseph's desire comes true as he is granted an audience before Pharaoh. This is what he had wanted 2 years prior. He had asked the butler, he said, remember me when you go to Pharaoh, speak of me, maybe there's a chance that I can come and have a chance to talk to Pharaoh to present what's going on. He's been wishing for this, he's been desiring this for 2 years. His hopes were crushed as it didn't come to pass. Now it comes to pass, something that he's wanted, something he's desired, and rather than pouncing on it and saying, this is my one chance for Pharaoh to hear my case, Joseph stays true to the task at hand. He doesn't get distracted by that. Number 3, furthermore, in this audience before Pharaoh, Pharaoh is in a position of needing Joseph. In verse number 15, Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've dreamed a dream. There's no one who can interpret it, but I've heard that you can. There's not a single person in all of my realm who is able to interpret this dream. You're the only one who can do it, and I need you. If the President of the United States were to ring my doorbell this week, I open the door and there stands the President. And he says, Mr. Peacock, we've searched all over America looking for somebody to build a cabinet. Can't find anybody in America to build a cabinet for the White House. I would say, you haven't looked very hard, number 1. Right? And we need you to build this cabinet for the White House. It has to be a special size. Will you give us a price on building that cabinet? Well, for the White House. I think there's an upcharge for White House cabinetry, you know. And if I'm the only one in America who can build it, you see how human nature works? Or pastor's human nature. Okay, maybe your human nature isn't quite like that. Joseph's in a position where he has gone from being a prisoner in a dungeon, forgotten, out of sight to most of Egypt, to Pharaoh saying, I need you to do something that nobody else can do. And yet in the midst of that, it doesn't go to Joseph's head. Why? Because he's brought before Pharaoh for the right reason. In Egypt, the pharaohs were worshipped as God. And God is revealing to Pharaoh, listen, Mr. Pharaoh, you think you're a God. You let people worship you as a God, but there's something that you can't figure out. You can't figure out your own dream. And there's wise men in your realm, and there's magicians in your realm, and they think that they're so wise, and there's something that they can't figure out, and this is this dream. But there's one of my own who I will speak to, and I will show to you that my power as God's being spoken through him is greater than anything in Egypt. That's the purpose. That's the reason why Joseph is brought before Pharaoh. Number 4, Joseph does not manipulate the circumstances for personal gain, but rather uses the circumstances to glorify God. Can you imagine if Joseph had said, well, Mr. Pharaoh, I'll give you the dream, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost my freedom plus $3 million. Pharaoh probably would have paid it. And God wouldn't have gotten the glory. Joseph doesn't manipulate the circumstances. He uses the circumstance to glorify God. Letter A, Joseph utters what ought to be commonly heard from the mouth of believers. It is not in me. God shall. It saddens me to hear pastors different times brag on what they've done in the ministry. I step back from that. You know, if there's anything that the Lord's accomplished here in this church or through this ministry or through any of the things I've been involved in my life, he's the one that gets the glory. It's not me. Jesus said, I will build my church. And when he does, he gets the glory. Listen, Joseph doesn't say, I'm going to do this. He says, this is God gets the glory. It's not in me. We often think of ourselves so much more highly than we ought to think. It's not in me, but God shall. And you can, without having that combination, you can go into a ditch on either side. You can go in the ditch and say, it's not me, I can't do anything. And what does that make our God look like? a weakling. If Joseph stood before Pharaoh and said, no, I'm just a normal guy like the rest of these guys, I can't interpret it, what's that make God look like? How is our God any different than their God? But Joseph doesn't say that. He says, it's not in me, but God will. My God is able to do that. I serve a God, I believe in a God who's still big today, who's still wanting to do great and mighty things. You read through. There's a message I don't know, I think I might have preached it here early on, but it's been a number of years. In that message, I'll go through and I'll take a section of that message and I'll open it up and say, what's your favorite miracle in the Bible? And let people share what their favorite miracle of the Bible is. And you know what it does? It begins to get us to think about the fact of just how big and just how strong our God is. And then at the end of that message, I'll tie it back together and say, listen, the same God who split open the Red Sea, who brought Daniel out of the lion's den and the 3 Hebrew children out of the fiery furnace, he's still the same God today. His power hasn't changed. I still believe him. I still serve him. He's still able and he still deserves all the glory. Letter B, the one who could interpret Pharaoh's dream would be greatly honored. Yet Joseph realized that honor belongs to God. That honor belongs to God. I heard a man one time preaching as Daniel is interpreting the handwriting on the wall. No other person in the realm could interpret that, but Daniel could. And the preacher, as he's preaching, he said the reason he could interpret it is because it was a letter from home. He knew the God who had written that letter. He knew the God who had written those words, and certainly Joseph knew the God who had given the dream to Pharaoh. Number 3, I have to hurry this morning. Joseph interprets the dreams to Pharaoh. In verses 14 through 32, we read about this. The Bible says in verse number 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. We read 14 through 16. I'm going to jump in right at 16 at the end there. It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Verse number 17. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow, and behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. These were horrible, nasty, weak cows. Verse number 20. And the lean and ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. Now I'm just going to pause, verse number 21. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning. So I awoke. What in the world did the butler bring to me for supper last night? I don't know what I ate, but this is a weird dream. These skinny cows eat fat cows, and they're still skinny cows. Now, I wish I could do that, all right? Because skinny cow, eat a cake and still be skinny, doesn't work that way for us in real life. But here's an interesting thing. He has these 2 dreams. Later on in the court, when Moses comes in, these magicians are going to cast down their serpents. Do you remember that? And what happens? Moses' serpent eats up the other serpents. And so this theme will continue on later on in the story. Verse number 22. When I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. Behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, and I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Letter A, we find that Pharaoh rehearses the dreams to Joseph, both ones. And then beginning in verse number 29, Joseph through 32, Joseph will give the interpretation. He says this, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Joseph gives this interpretation under letter B. Number 1, the 7 years of plenty are represented by 7 fat cows and the healthy ears of corn. 7 years of famine are represented by 7 skinny cows and shriveled ears of corn. The basic idea here was that the years of plenty were going to come first, and after that 7 years of famine would come that would eat up we completely forget about those good years. And Joseph goes on, letter C, to show that the repetition of the dreams, there had been 2 dreams that were the same meaning. The repetition of the dreams speaks to the emphasis and the urgency that God placed on the subject matter. In verse 32, Joseph makes it very clear that the dream was doubled because it's about to happen and you need to be prepared for this. In the Bible, God does not waste words. I don't believe He wastes words in the Bible. There are certain passages as you read through the Bible there, and there's things that are in there, and they're in there multiple times, and they're in there with repetition. To me, that always stands out as something that God wanted to be extra important. He's taken it, He's given it to us, He's given it to us again. And you say, Pastor, why do you mention that? For the same reason that that's the way that I parent my children. There are certain phrases that my children have probably grown to be sick of hearing. And if I were to ask for a show of hands, they could probably come up with as many of them as there are kids in my house. Right? They might not have become sick of hearing, but they've become familiar with hearing. How about this one? I'll start it. It takes. There it is. Takes 2 to fight and 1 to be a peacemaker. All I had to say was 2 words. It takes. Now, if I said to you, fill in the phrase, it takes, you might say, a village to raise a child. That's not in the Bible, all right? But in my home, if I don't even have to say the whole thing. All I have to say is, it takes. And they've heard it. Why do I say that phrase all over and over again? For emphasis and for urgency, both of them together. Right? God doesn't waste words. If He's said it, it's important. If He said it multiple times, we better realize how important it is. And so He does with Pharaoh. Number 4, we find Joseph's counsel to Pharaoh in verses 33 through 36. Joseph's given the interpretation of the dream. That's what he's been asked to do. In verses 33 through 36, he goes on. He says this, Now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. Joseph very easily could have stopped at the interpretation of the dream. Now, I'm not going to get to your A and B just yet. Joseph could have stopped at the interpretation of the dream. Pharaoh, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. It's coming. And he would have fulfilled his obligation. Right? But he goes on. Though, and this is interesting to me, though Joseph had been imprisoned in Egypt, he had been a slave in Egypt for 13 years at this point, he still has enough compassion to be looking out for Egypt. Letter A, the wisdom of God is practical, and it understands how to prepare for the future. It understands how to prepare for the future. Proverbs chapter number 6 is a passage that tells you, go to the ant. Consider their ways. Be wise. They plant. They don't have any guide. They don't have any overseer. They don't have any rulers. They prepare. They get ready for things that are coming. There's preparation that's involved. And listen, I believe if you're going to be godly, if you're going to be wise, you're going to be a person who prepares for what's coming. Now, Pastor, you know the future? I don't know all of the future. But listen, I think there's some things that we can do to be prepared. In Proverbs 22, in verse number 3, it talks about the prudent man. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse number 3 says this, the prudent man foreseeth the evil and does what? Hides himself. He doesn't hide himself and have a panic attack. He hides himself by preparing himself for what's coming. He foresees the evil, hides himself. The Bible goes on in verse number 3. But the simple pass on and are punished. Joseph's recommendation to Pharaoh is, Mr. Pharaoh, there are 7 years of difficulty that are coming. Let's prepare, let's plan, let's get ready for it so that when they come, we're not affected by it. We'll jump ahead. I'll jump ahead in the story here. By the time we get to the end of 7 years of famine, Egypt is not destroyed. What has happened by the end of that 7 years? Let me ask you, what has happened by the end of that 7 years? The people have made it how? Alive. There you go. They survived. What happened? Okay, and how did the people get the food that was in store? They sold their land. By the end of the famine, Pharaoh owns Egypt to a large degree. It was destroying regions around them, and yet God allowed Joseph to give this wisdom of God to Pharaoh. Let it be, Joseph, whose 13 years in Egypt have been marked by slavery and imprisonment, is still not seeking revenge against the Egyptians. Wouldn't human nature be to seek revenge? I was wrongfully imprisoned. Somebody's going to pay for this. Can you imagine if this happened in 21st century America? Somebody had been wrongfully imprisoned for 13 years and now they're needed. Would they say, let's look out for what's best for the country? Most of us would not do that. But God allowed Joseph to be introduced to Pharaoh at the right time by the right person for the right reason, that he would get the glory in all these things. We'll pick up there next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the truth of your word. We've been able to watch Joseph take a step from the prison to the palace in our lesson this morning. And the time will come, as we consider it next week, where Joseph will be placed into a position of leadership. And Lord, I believe much of that is a result, a blessing from you for his faithfulness to you. Over a long period of time, when he appeared to be forgotten, when he appeared to be misrepresented, when he appeared to be lied about and being trampled underfoot, and yet, Lord, you had a way of exalting him. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us to learn the lessons that we've looked at today in Joseph's life, to face every circumstance that comes into our path as an opportunity to give you the glory. Lord, it's not unto us that there needs to be glory, but it's unto you. And so, Lord, I pray that you'd help us to develop this heart that Joseph had of realizing it's not in us, but God can and God will do that which he's wanting to do, that he would be glorified. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to be faithful, to be used by you as vessels for your service, and we ask these things in your name.